The quiet night nurse. That's what they called Elena Martinez when they called her anything at all. Invisible. Competent but unremarkable. Hands that moved with mechanical precision through the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift at St. Michael's Hospital in Colorado Springs, where the fluorescent lights hummed their constant metallic prayer and the antiseptic smell hung thick enough to taste. Dr. Mercer watched her from across the nurses' station at 11:22 p.m. on a Tuesday, his eyes tracking her movements with the focused attention of a man studying something he'd already decided was insignificant. She pushed a medication cart down the corridor toward room 342, her sneakers silent on the tile, and he didn't recognize the way she moved, the economy of it, the precision that came from having practiced saving lives in places where wasted motion meant death. He didn't see the scars on her forearms that traced patterns only field medics recognize, compression marks from tourniquets applied under fire, thin white lines that curved around her wrists like memories. He didn't see the legend. He saw a night nurse in unremarkable scrubs, dark hair pulled back with a rubber band, moving through his hospital like she belonged nowhere. She'd been working at St. Michael's for 14 months. Before that, 5 years of silence. Elena paused outside room 342, checking the chart clip to the door frame. Lieutenant Commander Hayes. Admitted 6:15 this morning. Post-operative recovery from classified military operation. Civilian medical cover required per DOD protocol. The words meant nothing to the day staff. They meant everything to her. Her hand stilled for exactly 2 seconds, that's how long she allowed herself to process information. Hayes had led her son Miguel's SEAL team. Charlie Platoon. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines attached to JSOC Task Force 121 for the rotation that ended in Tikrit. The rotation where Miguel came home with a scar that ran from his collarbone to his ribs and stopped asking about his team. She adjusted her grip on the medication cart and entered the room. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm beside the bed. Hayes was sleeping, his chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance, force running into both arms, bandages visible beneath the hospital gown. Recovery from what, exactly, the charts didn't say. The classified notation was stamped across every page in red ink. She moved to his side with the practiced quietness of someone who'd done this in combat hospitals under mortar fire, checking his vitals with a practiced eye, a BP stable at 128/76, heart rate 62, oxygen saturation holding at 97% on the ventilator. She made notes in his chart, her handwriting precise and small, the script of someone trained to document under pressure. Hayes didn't stir. She was changing his bag when his eyes opened. Just for a moment. Just long enough for her to see something flicker across his expression, recognition, confusion, a question forming behind the pharmaceuticals keeping him sedated. Then his eyes closed again, and he was gone back into the chemical dark. Elena's jaw clenched imperceptibly. She finished the 4 change and stepped back, her breathing steady, her hand steady, everything about her steady as stainless steel. She turned and left the room without looking back. The nurse's station was quiet at 12:34 a.m., the way hospital nights are quiet, the absence of voices rather than the presence of peace. Elena pulled Hayes's full chart from the pneumatic tube system and set it on the counter to review his medication orders for the morning shift. The chart was thicker than post-op recovery usually warranted. She began reading, her eyes moving across the documentation with the speed of someone who'd memorized medical terminology in 3 languages. Surgical report. Classified. Anesthesia record. Normal parameters. Pain management protocol. Standard opioid rotation. And then she saw it, a line in the billing codes that didn't match the reported procedure. A billing code for a surgical exploration that didn't exist in any of the operative notes. Then another. A third. Phantom surgeries. False billing records. The kind of financial infrastructure that exists for one reason, hiding something real underneath. Elena's hand stilled on the page. Her right hand. The tremor that had been manageable for the past 14 months suddenly became very difficult to hide. She gripped the pen tighter, focusing on the pressure of plastic against her fingers. This was the moment. This was the exact moment when she could have closed the chart and walked away. When she could have decided that whatever billing inconsistency existed at St. Michael's was not her problem, not her discovery, not her business. She closed the chart and set it back on the stack. She did not report the billing codes. She did not mention them to the night supervisor. She did not send an email to the hospital administrator. She kept her hand steady and her voice level when the charge nurse asked her to verify the 4 pump settings in room 316. That was at 1:19 a.m. What she didn't know was that Dr. Mercer had watched her reading that chart. That he'd seen the moment her eyes caught on the phantom billing codes. That he'd been standing 3 feet away at the file cabinet, his own chart in hand, his own hands very still, his own breathing very controlled as he calculated exactly how dangerous her quiet competence had just become. At 3:24 a.m., Elena took her break in the supply closet on the 3rd floor, the one nobody used anymore since they'd renovated the main break room. She sat on a plastic storage bin and held her phone in both hands, steadying the tremor that had returned to her right hand now that no one was watching. She called Miguel. He answered on the 2nd ring because he always did when it was her calling at 3:38 in the morning, the way sons do when they've learned that their mother doesn't call at strange hours unless something is wrong. "Hey, Mom. You okay?" His voice was thick with sleep and concern, the same voice that used to ask if she could check his homework from deployments that he wasn't supposed to tell her about. "I'm fine, mijo. Just checking in. How's the team?" She kept her voice level, just an ordinary mother calling her son during a night shift. "Normal. Safe. Uncomplicated." Miguel yawned. "Good. We're running PT at 0600. Actually, I was going to call you tomorrow. We have a new CO, Lieutenant Commander Hayes. He's running some intensive work with Charlie Platoon. He's intense, Mom. Good leader? You'd respect him." Elena's eyes closed. She pulled up a photo on her phone from the St. Michael's record system, the DOD-issued identification photo that came with classified admission paperwork, the kind of photo that authenticated emergency contact information. She held the phone to her ear with one hand and looked at Hayes's face. Older than she remembered. Scarred along the left temple. Same eyes, though. That particular shade of gray that meant he'd seen things that couldn't be unseen. "He sounds like a solid leader," Elena said quietly. "Has he been deployed with the team long?" She was asking this question and already knowing the answer and terrified of knowing the answer, all at the same time. "About 4 years with our unit. Did 2 rotations in Tikrit before that. He's the one who brought half the team home alive after the IED strike in 2019. You know, the ambush that," Miguel stopped himself. The ambush he wasn't supposed to talk about. The ambush that had classified details that stretched back 5 years. The ambush that had involved someone who held a perimeter while a convoy burned. "He's a good officer, Mom. The guys trust him." Elena opened her eyes and looked at the photo again. Hayes's jaw was set the way it always was, tight and controlled, the expression of someone holding too much weight behind their teeth. "That's good, mijo. That's really good. Get some sleep. Tell the team I'm proud of them." She ended the call and sat in the supply closet with her phone in her lap, breathing in the smell of disinfectant and plastic bottles, and counted to 10, and then counted to 10 again. By 4:15 a.m., she was ready to finish her shift. By 4:16 a.m., she was checking on room 342 one more time, confirming Hayes's vitals were stable, his oxygen saturation holding, his recovery tracking normal parameters. She made notes in his chart in her precise, small handwriting. She did not allow herself to imagine what had happened to him in Tikrit. She did not allow herself to think about the 5 years between the deployment and this hospital room. She moved through the rest of her shift with the fluid economy of someone who'd learned to conserve emotion the way soldiers conserve ammunition. And at 7 a.m., when the day shift arrived and she was pulling off her stethoscope and folding her badge into her pocket, Dr. Mercer was standing at the medication cart, reviewing Hayes's chart with an expression that looked like someone had just handed him a loaded weapon and shown him where to aim. Elena didn't see the expression. She was already walking toward the exit. But the fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they always did, indifferent to everything, recording nothing, forgetting nothing. The Grand Rounds conference room smelled like expensive cologne and institutional coffee. 30 physicians and medical students crowded around the mahogany table as Dr. Mercer pulled up Elena's charting on the projection screen. Her name appeared in clean black font above a series of nursing notes from the previous week. The fluorescent lights cast everything in surgical white. This, Dr. Mercer said, gesturing with a laser pointer that traced red circles across her documentation, is what happens when we lower our standards at St. Michael's. His voice carried the weight of authority, the kind that made residents straighten in their chairs and students stop taking notes. Note the creative interpretation of protocol here. The unauthorized medication timing. He paused, letting the silence settle like sediment. Perhaps our night shift operates under different rules than the rest of us. Laughter rippled through the room. Polite. Controlled. Practiced. Elena stood against the back wall where she'd been instructed to stand, her hands folded at her sides. Her jaw clenched once, a single muscular flex that lasted less than a second, and then her face returned to perfect neutrality. She'd worn her scrubs to Grand Rounds because that's what nurses did. What they were told to do. She watched a resident she'd trained 3 months ago, watched him teach a post-op patient how to use an incentive spirometer, deliberately avoid her eyes. His pen suddenly became fascinating. The medication administration times are particularly concerning, Dr. Mercer continued, still pointing at her notes. His tone had shifted. No longer academic. Now it carried the weight of disappointment, the kind reserved for people who were fundamentally disappointing. One might wonder if night shift staff fully comprehend the protocols we establish here. Or perhaps there's simply a gap in the caliber we've come to expect. He clicked to the next slide. Another nurse's charting. This one was perfect. Immaculate. The students made approving sounds. Elena's breathing remained steady. In through her nose. Out through her mouth. A technique she'd learned in a different lifetime, in a different uniform, in a place where the cost of flinching was measured in body bags. She'd stood in a surgical tent in Tikrit while mortar fire shook the walls and mortality rates climbed. She'd watched her commanding officer read casualty lists with the same detached tone Dr. Mercer was using now. The difference was that the commanding officer had been telling the truth about casualties. Dr. Mercer was lying about charting errors that didn't exist. The room felt small despite its size. The walls seemed to press inward. Elena focused on a spot above the projector screen and held it steady. 63 minutes later, she stood at the vending machine in the staff lounge, feeding a dollar bill into the slot with mechanical precision. The machine hummed and stuttered, that annoying electronic sound that meant it was thinking, processing, deciding. Coffee. Black. No cream. That was the drink of someone who'd learned to accept bitterness without complaint. The button clicked. The machine dispensed. A cup fell into the collection tray with a soft thud. Dr. Mercer appeared beside her like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. She could smell his cologne now, sharp, expensive, chemical. The kind of scent that announced arrival like a command. You might want to update that resume, Martinez. His voice was loud enough to carry to the 3 nurses eating lunch at the table near the windows. Loud enough to be overheard. That was the point. Start looking before security has to escort you out. Save yourself the embarrassment. He paused. His smile was the kind that didn't reach his eyes, practiced and cold, like a snake showing its teeth. Though I suppose working here was always a bit above your pay grade, wasn't it? Elena selected her coffee. The cup filled with dark liquid that steamed slightly in the cool air. She lifted it from the dispenser with steady hands. Then she turned her head, meeting his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Her gaze was a still pond, no ripples, no emotion, nothing to give him purchase. She held his stare until his smile flickered. Until something in his face registered that this approach wasn't working the way he'd planned. Then she looked past him and walked back toward the patient floors, the warm coffee cup held between her palms like an offering or a shield. 3 nurses watched her leave. She heard one of them whisper something to the others. She didn't turn around. 10 minutes later, Elena stood alone in the supply closet on the 4th floor. Metal shelves rose around her in institutional gray, stacked with gauze, syringes, tape, bandages, the infrastructure of healing arranged in perfect rows. The door was closed. The light was dim. She gripped the edge of the metal counter until her knuckles went white and the blood beneath the skin seemed to recede from the pressure. Her breathing changed then. Not breaking. Just changing. Becoming deeper. Becoming something that moved through her like a storm she could feel but not control. She held the counter for 47 seconds. Then she released it. Then she straightened her spine and walked back out into the hallway where no one could see anything wrong. But that wasn't the worst part. At shift change, as Elena moved through her final rounds on the 4th floor, she noticed the schedule changes posted on the nursing station bulletin board. 3 names: Sarah Cho, assigned to pediatrics on the opposite side of the hospital. Marcus Williams, transferred to ICU on the 3rd floor. Jennifer Patterson, moved to the emergency department, a different building entirely. All 3 nurses who worked regularly with Elena. All 3 nurses who knew exactly how competent she was. All 3 nurses who would have testified, if asked, about her precision, her knowledge, her ability to catch things that others missed. They were gone before the next shift began. The schedule that posted for the following week showed Elena's name in a pattern that made the redistribution strategy obvious. Overnight shifts only. Every single one. The overnight shift when the nursing supervisors went home at midnight. When the hospital skeleton staff was reduced to essential personnel. When witnesses were minimized and documentation became a record kept in silence. Elena stood at the bulletin board for 30 seconds, reading her name in the new slots. Then she turned away and continued her rounds. She had 8 more patients to see before sunrise. 8 more sets of vitals to check. 8 more chances to be perfect and invisible simultaneously. She didn't know yet that Dr. Mercer had already called the head of nursing with vague concerns about her performance trajectory. She didn't know that he'd used phrases like potential safety issues and documentation gaps that would mysteriously appear in her personnel file. She didn't know that he'd also called a physician recruiter in Denver, setting up a confidential conversation about a lucrative opportunity at a private surgery center that didn't require night shift work, a conversation designed to make it seem like she'd be pushing herself out, not being driven out. What Elena did know was that something fundamental had shifted. The hospital she'd worked at for 3 years had suddenly become a place where the air tasted different. Where conversation stopped when she approached. Where her name had changed from Elena to Nurse Nobody in exactly 48 hours. Where the man who'd once pretended to respect her had decided she was a threat large enough to orchestrate a systematic removal. She didn't know why yet. Not the real reason. Not the phantom surgeries. Not the billing codes. Not the fraud that Dr. Mercer had built his reputation and his very substantial savings account upon. She only knew that she'd seen something she shouldn't have, and that visibility had become liability. Around midnight, as she was hanging a fresh fur bag for an elderly patient with congestive heart failure, Elena's phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from Miguel, her 17-year-old son. "When are they letting you see Commander Hayes again?" "He asked about me. He said he was with Dad's unit." She read the message 3 times. Her hands remained steady as she secured the 4 tubing and adjusted the flow rate. But something in her chest tightened. She knew exactly who Commander Hayes was. She knew what unit patch he carried in his jacket lining. She knew because she'd sewn those same patches, had worn that same insignia, had answered to a call sign that no one was supposed to remember anymore. She texted back, "They reassigned me, mijo. I'm not on that floor anymore." The response came quickly, "That's not fair. He's the only one who knows Dad." She set the phone down without responding and finished her rounds. But as she walked the corridors of St. Michael's Hospital in the dark hours before dawn, Elena Martinez understood something with the clarity of someone who'd learned to read danger the way others read faces. She understood that the man upstairs on the 6th floor, the Navy SEAL recovering from surgery, the commanding officer who had served with her son's father, had just been removed from her reach. And that removal had happened on purpose. By design. By someone who knew exactly what she represented. By someone who was terrified of what she might tell him. The meeting happened at 3 in the afternoon in the administrator's office on the 7th floor, where sunlight cut through floor-to-ceiling windows and made everything look clean. Dr. Mercer sat across from Janet Chen, the hospital administrator, with the kind of posture that suggested he'd been invited, not summoned. He hadn't been summoned. He'd requested the meeting himself, his email marked urgent, and Janet had cleared her calendar because that's what administrators do when physicians request urgent conversations. "I'm concerned," Dr. Mercer said, folding his hands on the mahogany desk between them. "Patient safety concerns, specifically. Elena Martinez, night shift nurse, geriatrics rotation, has shown increasingly concerning judgment patterns over the past several weeks." Janet leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking softly. "What kind of patterns?" "Documentation irregularities. Questions about billing codes that fall outside her scope of practice. A tendency to involve herself in medical decisions that should remain with attending physicians." He paused, letting the silence do work. "I'm not saying she's intentionally problematic. I'm saying her judgment is compromised. And I worry that her judgment is putting patients at risk." It was perfect. Technically accurate. Strategically lethal. Elena had reviewed billing codes, but she'd done it during a routine chart audit that was literally her job. She'd asked medical questions because she was a night nurse in a hospital, and asking medical questions was how you stayed competent. But when filtered through Dr. Mercer's narrative, when framed as pattern, as judgment failure, as safety risk, the truth became something else entirely. The truth became a liability. "Has there been a specific incident?" Janet asked, her pen poised over a legal pad. "Not a single incident. That's what makes this difficult. It's a pattern of behavior. Small things. But small things add up." He leaned forward, his voice dropping into the register that suggested confidentiality. "I'd hate to see her records become the focus of a licensing review down the road because we didn't document our concerns appropriately now. Protective documentation. For everyone involved." Janet nodded. She understood the implication. Document the concerns now, and if something happened later, the hospital was protected. Fail to document, and the hospital looked negligent. Mercer was giving her a way to be thorough. To be safe. "I'll draft a formal written warning," Janet said. "We should place it in her file. That way, if there are future issues, we have a timeline." "Thank you," Mercer said, and stood to leave. "I just want what's best for the hospital. And for Elena, honestly. Early intervention is always better than waiting until there's a real crisis." He was already thinking 3 moves ahead, the way a chess player sees captures before they happen. The warning would go in her file. The warning would make her a liability. And if she ever tried to report the phantom surgical billing codes, if she ever went to the State Board or the FBI or anyone, her own file would already be flagged with concerns about her judgment. Who would believe a nurse with documented credibility issues over a respected attending physician? The second call happened the same evening. Dr. Mercer sat in his Audi in the hospital parking lot, the exterior dark now, the sun collapsed behind the Front Range Mountains. He dialed the Colorado Medical Board's administrative line. The phone rang 4 times before someone picked up. "I need to report some concerns," he said, and his voice was calm, measured, the voice of a colleague who'd done this before. "This is Dr. Charles Mercer, attending physician at St. Michael's Hospital in Colorado Springs. I'm calling about a nurse on our geriatrics rotation. Elena Martinez. I've become aware that she may have been conducting unauthorized investigations into hospital billing and operational procedures." The woman on the other end, probably a secretary, probably had been taking these calls for 15 years, said, "Can you elaborate on that, doctor?" She's been accessing billing records that fall outside her scope of practice. Asking questions about phantom charges, unusual coding patterns. The concern isn't that she found something, the concern is that she's conducting an investigation into hospital operations without authorization or proper channels. That falls under several regulatory violations we should probably be aware of. It was poisonous in its precision. He wasn't accusing Elena of doing anything illegal. He was simply raising concerns that she was operating outside her scope. The Colorado Medical Board would file a complaint. They'd send a letter. They'd open an inquiry. And suddenly Elena wouldn't just be a quiet night nurse, she'd be someone the state was investigating. The stigma alone would end her career in Colorado Springs. He hung up and pulled out of the parking lot at exactly 6:48 p.m., his headlights cutting through the darkening evening, his hand steady on the wheel. The formal written warning appeared in Elena's personnel file on Friday morning. She discovered it when she clocked in for her shift, a notice on the break room bulletin board requesting all staff to verify their files had been reviewed. The warning itself was a small document, neatly printed on hospital letterhead. It cited documentation irregularities and concerning judgment patterns without specifying exactly what those patterns were. It was signed by Janet Chen and countersigned by Dr. Mercer. Elena read it twice. The first time, looking for specifics. The second time, understanding the strategy. She signed the acknowledgement form without comment, her signature precise and measured, no tremor in her hand. The pen didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench visibly. She simply folded the document, placed it in the envelope provided, and handed it to the nursing supervisor, who accepted it with the awkward sympathy of someone who knew this was being orchestrated but couldn't prove it. "I'm sorry," the supervisor said quietly. "Mercer's been tough on everyone lately." Elena nodded once and walked to her assigned station without responding. Pity was a courtesy she couldn't afford. Pity meant people noticed you. Pity meant explanations. That night, she worked the geriatrics floor in a hospital that suddenly felt smaller, the corridors narrower, the walls pressing closer. She checked vitals on patients with dementia and congestive heart failure, dispensed medications, documented everything with the precision of someone creating a record that could be used against her. Every line of her charting was now potential evidence. Every notation was now part of a narrative someone else was constructing. By midnight, she'd settled into the rhythm of the quiet floors. Most of her assigned patients were sleeping. The hospital had the particular silence of 2 a.m., fluorescent lights buzzing their constant electronic hymn, distant monitors beeping their steady rhythm, the occasional voice from the ICU paging a code or requesting a consult. She finished her rounds at 2:11 a.m. and found herself with 15 minutes before the next set of vitals. The basement laundry room was empty this late, the industrial washers humming their metallic songs, the dryers cycling warm air that smelled of bleach and worn fabric. It was where people went when they needed to disappear for a moment. Elena collected her shift scrubs from the bin where she'd left them that morning. The pale blue fabric was still warm from the dryer, soft cotton that had been washed and folded 1,000 times. She selected a warm pair from the stacks of clean uniforms. The one she'd worn today went into the designated hamper with all the others, indistinguishable, replaceable. But before she dropped them in, she folded them. Not the careless fold of someone tossing laundry into a bin. The careful, precise fold of someone who understood that how you treat small things matters. She creased the first sleeve, then the second, her hands moving with muscle memory from another lifetime. Long sleeves folded lengthwise, then thirds. Torso aligned and creased. Each movement deliberate, meditative, the way she'd folded dress uniforms before ceremonies, before briefings, before operations that had no names. Crease after crease. Fold after fold. Each one perfect. The scrubs in her hands were just cotton and thread, the uniform of temporary work, the costume of her invisibility. But the way she folded them, with care, with respect, with the attention of someone saying goodbye, transformed the act into something else. It was ritual. It was acknowledgement. It was the only way she could mark the boundary between the nurse she was pretending to be and the soldier she actually was. She placed the folded scrubs in the hamper and stepped back. The basement laundry room hummed around her, industrial and indifferent. The clock on the wall read 2:43 a.m. Her next round started in 2 minutes. Elena climbed the stairs back to the 4th floor, her pace measured, her expression neutral. In room for 12, Mr. Henderson's blood pressure was slightly elevated. In room for 08, Mrs. Ko was finally sleeping without morphine. In room for 14, the new admission from the ER was stable, vitals trending in the right direction. She moved through her duties with the mechanical precision of someone whose hands had been trained for something far more consequential than this, but who had learned that the smallest tasks, done well, were a form of resistance. They proved she existed. They proved she was competent. They created a record. At 4:17 a.m., while Elena was checking a glucose monitor in room for 10, an alarm started screaming from the 4th floor above her. Not a gentle alarm. Not a warning. A full code alert. The overhead system crackled to life. Code blue, room 342. Code blue, room 342. All available personnel respond. Elena's hands froze for exactly 1 breath. Room 342. The restricted floor. The floor where Hayes was recovering. The Navy SEAL she hadn't seen in 5 years. The commander who'd led her son's team. Dr. Mercer would be on that floor in under 2 minutes. He had privileges on every floor. He had authority everywhere. Elena had no assignment there. She had no right to respond. She'd already been flagged for overstepping boundaries, for concerning judgment, for operating outside her scope of practice. The code alarm continued its electronic wail through the hospital corridors. She set down the glucose monitor on the bedside table with deliberate care, checked that her patient was stable, and then she walked. Not ran. Walked. Professional pace. Her badge clipped to her scrubs, her hands in her pockets, her face the mask of a hospital employee responding to a standard emergency. The stairwell door was metal and heavy. It closed behind her with a pneumatic sigh. Elena's hands were steady on the stairwell rail as she descended, muscle memory and training fusing into something that didn't feel like resignation anymore. It felt like waiting. The basement laundry room had shown her what she already knew, that some doors, once closed, don't open again. She was halfway through the ground floor corridor when the overhead intercom crackled, Code Blue, Room 342. Code Blue, Room 342. Her feet didn't make a decision. They just moved. She hit the 4th floor stairwell at a dead sprint, her badge already in her hand, the plastic card flashing past the security reader before anyone could stop her. The stairwell door swung open with a pneumatic hiss. Room 342 was 3 doors down. She could see the chaos before she reached it, the Code Blue team already assembling, the crash cart positioned outside the door, 2 residents frozen in the hallway like statues, their faces the color of wet sand. Hayes was convulsing on the bed when she entered. Dr. Mercer stood at the foot of the mattress, barking contradictory orders at the code team. Get an EKG, someone tell me what we're working with here, where's the damn chest x-ray from this morning? His voice had the tone of someone performing command rather than exercising it. The attending physician hadn't arrived yet. The nurses were moving in that urgent blur motion, but no one was moving with purpose. No one was moving with knowledge. Elena read Hayes's body the way she'd read 100 dying men in buildings that used to have roofs. Chest wall moving wrong. Jugular vein distended like he was drowning in his own veins. The telltale pattern, not respiratory failure, not sepsis, cardiac tamponade. Blood compressing the heart. The pulmonary embolism had broken free somewhere and lodged itself in the pulmonary artery, and now his pericardium was filling with blood that had nowhere to go. He needs immediate decompression, Elena said, already moving to the crash cart. Her voice came out flat, medical, matter-of-fact. Left anterolateral thoracotomy. We're looking at 5 minutes before irreversible cardiac failure. Everyone in the room turned to stare at her. Dr. Mercer's jaw tightened. You're not assigned to this floor. You're not assigned to this patient. Get out. Now. She ignored him. Her hands were already on the crash cart, pulling the surgical drape, the iodine prep, a scalpel with a blade that caught the fluorescent light like a promise. The second resident, a trauma surgery resident who looked like he was barely old enough to vote, made a move to stop her. Elena looked at him. Just looked. The same flat combat stare she'd used in Tikrit when a medic panicked and tried to move a femoral bleed. The resident stepped back. If you do this, you're done here, Mercer hissed, his voice suddenly quiet, which was somehow worse than shouting. You understand that? Career over. Nursing license revoked. I will personally ensure. Elena met his eyes for exactly 1 second. She didn't nod. Didn't acknowledge him. She simply turned to Hayes, who was still conscious enough to understand what was about to happen, and she said, "This will hurt for 6 seconds. After that, you'll live." She didn't wait for a response. Her hands moved with muscle memory that had nothing to do with civilian nursing protocols or hospital regulations or the chain of command that Dr. Mercer was still invoking behind her. Her hands moved the way they'd moved in a blown-out clinic in Tikrit with mortars landing close enough to shake the walls, with a 19-year-old Marine whose left side had taken fragmentation from an IED. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who'd done this in darkness, under fire, with nothing but training and the absolute knowledge that hesitation meant death. She prepped the chest wall with iodine in one smooth motion, her fingers locating the fourth intercostal space by feel alone. The scalpel went in between the ribs with a sound like fabric tearing. Blood bloomed dark and immediate. She deepened the cut, working fast, precise, her breathing controlled while Hayes gasped and his monitor shrieked and the residents watched with their mouths open like they'd forgotten how to function. The pericardium was distended, stretched tight as a balloon. One more incision. Her fingers went in, her bare hands, against every protocol, against every hospital standard, against everything, and she found what was killing him. Blood. So much blood. She evacuated it with efficient pressure, draining the pericardium, releasing the pressure on his heart, and Hayes's monitor began to stabilize. His oxygen saturation climbed, 68, 71, 76, 82, 88. His heart rate steadied from the frantic 140s into something approximating life. The room exhaled. Elena was still moving, still working, when Mercer's voice cut through like a blade, "Everyone out. Now. Everyone except the residents. Out." The nurses filed out first, their eyes locked on her with something between gratitude and terror. The second resident backed toward the door, his hands up as if in surrender. Elena didn't look at any of them. She was checking Hayes's pupils, checking his pulse, confirming what the monitor already showed, he was breathing. He was alive. She'd held his chest cavity together while fire rained down on a convoy 5 years ago, and she'd just done it again with a scalpel from a crash cart. Dr. Mercer's face had gone the color of slate. "Get out," he said to Elena. Not loud. Controlled. Which meant he'd already made his decision about what came next. She left him there and walked toward the elevator with blood drying on her gloved hands. The first phone call came at 7:16 a.m., approximately 90 minutes after Elena left the hospital. Hospital attorney, her name was Jennifer Caldwell, and Mercer had spun the entire narrative into something that sounded almost plausible if you didn't know better. Unauthorized surgical intervention, he'd said. A nurse performing a procedure reserved for surgeons. Clear violation of scope of practice. Reckless endangerment. He'd used the word unqualified for times in a row, let it sit in the silence, then added, "I'm documenting everything." The second call came at 8:14 a.m. to the hospital board vice chair, a man named Castellano who'd been on the board for 6 years and spent most meetings checking his Rolex. Mercer's voice on that call was different, more conspiratorial, more intimate. He was protecting St. Michael's, he explained. Protecting the hospital from a liability that walked on 2 legs and wore scrubs. If word gets out that we allowed an unqualified nurse to perform emergency procedures, he said, the insurance company will drop us. The Joint Commission will audit us. We'll lose accreditation. The third call came at 8:52 a.m. to the Colorado Medical Board's licensure division. Mercer filed a formal complaint against Elena before the ICU nurses had even finished documenting Hayes' procedure. He didn't mention that Hayes was alive. He didn't mention that without Elena's intervention, the patient would be dead. What he mentioned was deviation from scope of practice, unauthorized surgical procedure, negligent endangerment of a patient. He mentioned that she disregarded his direct orders. He mentioned, carefully, with just the right tone of regret, that she seemed unstable, that she'd been making irregular decisions for weeks. By 9:13 a.m., Elena was being escorted to the administrator's office on the second floor. Richard Cole, the hospital administrator, was the kind of man who'd learned to deliver bad news with the tone of someone expressing sympathy for a tragic situation. He had the dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept, and a file folder open on his desk with Elena's name on the tab. Not her official file. A new one. Constructed in the last 2 hours. "Elena," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk, "please sit." She sat today. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her back was straight. She looked like a woman who'd already accepted her fate. "Dr. Mercer came to me this morning with serious concerns about a procedure you performed on a patient in room 342 without proper authorization or surgical training. Without his permission." Cole paused, as if giving her space to interrupt. "She didn't. The board has reviewed the incident report. The state medical board is being notified. And I'm afraid." He opened his hands slightly, a gesture of helplessness. "I'm afraid we have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings, Anne." Elena's voice was quiet when she spoke, quieter than it had been since that moment in room 342. The patient would be dead without that intervention. Cardiac tamponade from a thromboembolic event. Blood compressing the myocardium. He had 5 minutes, maybe less, before complete cardiogenic shock. Cole's expression tightened slightly. "I understand you have military medical training." "Not training. Experience. I was a combat medic for 12 years. I've performed field thoracotomies under conditions Dr. Mercer couldn't conceptualize. That patient is alive because I was in that room and Dr. Mercer was not. Elena, those procedures, those decisions, they're outside your scope as a nurse. I understand your background is, shall we say, unusual, but there are protocols. There are chains of command. Dr. Mercer is the supervising physician, and you directly contravened his orders. The hospital cannot support that kind of deviation, no matter the outcome." Cole slid the folder across the desk. "I need you to sign this acknowledgement of termination. You can collect references from HR on your way out. Any benefits questions can be directed to payroll." She looked at the paperwork without reading it. She already knew what it said. She'd known it since the moment Dr. Mercer had made his 3 phone calls, from the moment she'd chosen Hayes over her career. She signed her name on the line he indicated, her handwriting steady, precise, exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd spent 2 decades writing medical reports in the dark. The basement laundry room was empty at 10:27 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Elena stood in front of the industrial washer-dryer units, a cardboard box tucked under her arm containing her personal locker items, a photograph of Miguel in his dress uniform from his graduation ceremony, a stethoscope that had cost $200 and would soon be someone else's stethoscope, a coffee mug with St. Michael's ER 2019 printed on the side. She pulled the hospital-issue scrubs from the dryer, still warm, the fabric soft from 5 years of washings. She folded them methodically. Sleeve. Sleeve. Body. Pants. Each crease precise, military perfect, the way she'd learned before she was old enough to vote. The fabric smelled like industrial bleach and something else, something like the end of something. She was halfway to her car, the cardboard box growing heavier with every step across the parking lot, when she heard the voice that stopped her dead. "MOM. Miguel burst through the hospital's front entrance like someone had fired him out of a cannon, his senior year of high school converting into muscle memory he didn't know he had. He was moving fast, his chest heaving, his eyes wild, and he was holding something against his chest like it was made of spun glass. Elena's shadow box. The shadow box that had been sealed in the back of her bedroom closet for 5 years. The shadow box that contained decorations she'd stopped allowing herself to remember. Bronze star. Silver star. 2 purple hearts in their small wooden cases. A Navy commendation ribbon. All the things she'd learned to be invisible about. Miguel, no, Elena said, her voice flat, controlled, even as her mind ran through the calculations of damage control. What did you do? I found it, Miguel said, breathing hard. Mom, I found it when I was looking for the power cord for your laptop. I found all of it. And then I found out about Hayes. And I know you got fired. I know what happened. And Mom, look, people are. He lifted the shadow box higher, and that was when Elena noticed the small crowd gathering near the ambulance bay. 2 paramedics. A security guard. A woman in a visitor's badge. All of them staring at the ribbons catching the Colorado Springs sunlight like fire. Miguel, put that down, Elena said, her voice dropping an octave. Not a request. An order. But it was too late. A nurse she recognized from the 3rd floor was already pointing. A doctor was already walking toward them. And before Elena could move, before she could grab the shadow box and disappear, Miguel was pulling her back toward the hospital entrance, his arm linked through hers with the kind of grip that was both teenage boy strength and something harder beneath it, the genetic memory of a son knowing his mother needed protection. They need to see, Miguel said. They need to know. The stairwell doors were already closing behind them. Elena was halfway to her car, cardboard box tucked under one arm, when the hospital's front entrance exploded open behind her. Miguel burst through the glass doors like he was breaching a compound, her shadow box of military medals clutched against his chest, and his voice cut through the parking lot ambulance bay like a Black Hawk rotor wash. Mom, they need to see these. He said it loud enough to stop the crowd. Loud enough to make the paramedics pause mid-transfer. Loud enough to make everyone turn, and suddenly Elena wasn't invisible anymore, she was the center of something she couldn't control. The shadow box was worn leather, the kind that holds things that matter. Inside, ribbons in colors most people never learn the names for. Bronze. Crimson. Gold thread catching the afternoon light. The box had lived in her closet for 5 years, the clasp still tight, the photographs inside still sealed against time. She hadn't opened it since the day she'd closed the door on Captain Elena Martinez and opened it on just a nurse. Miguel held it up like evidence. Like proof. The hospital doors swung open again, and this time it wasn't security. It was Hayes. Still wearing the fur line in his arm like a tether to his recovery, still moving like a man learning how to trust his own body again, but awake now. Conscious. Alive because of what she'd done in that frozen moment when protocol had meant nothing and muscle memory had meant everything. He looked at the shadow box in Miguel's hands. He looked at the ribbons. And something shifted in his face, a recognition so complete it erased 5 years in a single breath. Valkyrie, he whispered. The name hung in the Colorado Springs air like a bullet hole. Hayes reached inside his jacket, the movement careful, controlled, the movement of a man who'd been trained to telegraph nothing. His fingers found something sewn into the lining, a patch worn soft by 5 years of carrying weight. A faded unit patch from Tikrit. From the convoy. From the moment when a female combat medic had held the perimeter while the world exploded around her, the moment when Elena had stopped being invisible even though the Pentagon had ordered her to disappear. He pulled the patch free and spoke from memory, from a citation he'd memorized the way some men memorize their own names, Captain Elena Martinez, for extraordinary valor in combat operations. When her convoy was ambushed in Tikrit, she single-handedly held a perimeter for 4 hours, treating casualties under sustained fire, refusing evacuation, refusing to leave her position until every soldier had been extracted or accounted for. That's not protocol. Dr. Mercer's voice cut through the moment like a scalpel. He'd followed Elena out, his face flushed, his voice rising. That's classified. That information is classified, Anne. But he didn't get another word. Because a Marine colonel was stepping forward from the crowd, he'd been visiting a patient on the 3rd floor, was still in dress blues, still moving with the kind of precision that came from 40 years of service. He took the patch from Hayes's hand with the reverence of a man handling a flag. "I know this unit," the colonel said, and his voice was the kind of quiet that makes rooms listen. He continued reading, his voice steady, despite injury sustained. "Captain Martinez coordinated emergency field medicine for a 12-man team, establishing triage protocols under mortar fire, and orchestrating evacuation procedures that resulted in 0 fatalities when casualty rates were projected at 70%. The crowd wasn't breathing anymore. And then a 2-star general paused mid-stride through the hospital's entrance. He'd been arriving for a fundraiser on the top floor, still in service dress, still carrying the weight of command in the set of his shoulders. He saw the shadow box. He saw the patch. He saw Elena standing with her cardboard box of belongings like she was just another fired nurse being escorted out. He walked straight to her. And he saluted. Not a casual gesture. Not a nod. A full-dress salute, the kind you give to commanding officers, the kind that means respect, that means recognition, that means you understand exactly who is standing in front of you. The general's hand came up to his temple, held there for a full 3 seconds while the paramedics stopped moving and the nurses in the ambulance bay stared, and Miguel stood with the shadow box like he was holding history itself. "Captain," the general said. Just one word. But it was a word that rewrote everything. Dr. Mercer's face went the color of old snow. The kind of white that comes when all the blood drains away and doesn't come back. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again, but no sound came out because somewhere in the last 90 seconds, his world had restructured itself into something he couldn't recognize. A Pentagon liaison appeared 20 minutes later, the kind of appearance that suggests a phone call had been made, that protocols had been activated, that classified system somewhere had been tasked with the very specific problem of confirming one name, Valkyrie. The liaison stepped outside the hospital's main doors where the crowd had grown to include hospital staff, security, 2 news vans, and a gathering of people who suddenly understood that the nurse they'd watched take verbal abuse for months had been a combat veteran all along. Codename Valkyrie has been reactivated and cleared for public acknowledgement, the liaison announced. Not a question. Not a suggestion. A statement of fact, delivered with the kind of authority that comes from the Pentagon itself. Captain Elena Martinez's service record is approved for declassification as of this hour. Dr. Mercer was still standing there, still frozen in that moment of understanding when the ground beneath him gave way. But the ground didn't stop shaking. Because by that evening, the hospital security cameras had leaked footage, or been leaked, depending on who was asking, of the vending machine encounter. Of Dr. Mercer's voice dripping contempt. Of him calling her nurse nobody. Of his suggestion that she update her resume before security escorted her out. The video went viral in 4 hours. By morning, it had 3 million views. And somewhere in a study lined with textbooks and diplomas, Dr. Mercer's own medical school mentor, a legendary surgeon whose ethical framework had defined an entire generation of physicians, saw the footage and released a public statement, "I am horrified. I am ashamed. The man in that video does not represent the values I taught. I hereby disown any professional association with Dr. Gerald Mercer and am personally requesting a full board investigation into his conduct." The board investigation took 18 days. The phantom billing codes, the surgeries billed but never performed, the insurance fraud stretching back 18 months, the financial crimes Elena had glimpsed and never mentioned to anyone, came to light like oil slick spreading across water. By Friday morning, Dr. Mercer's surgical privileges were suspended. By the following week, his medical license was under formal review. By the end of the month, his name was being quietly removed from every roster, every conference, every country club directory in Colorado Springs. The Colorado Springs medical community is small. It remembers. It doesn't forgive. 6 months passed like a held breath. Elena sat in the St. Michael's cafeteria wearing the same scrubs she'd once folded in the basement laundry room like a funeral ritual. But this time, the silver oak leaves of her captain rank gleamed on her collar, real and visible and impossible to miss. The tremor in her right hand, the one that had started the day Mercer first mocked her, was gone. Her hands were steady again. Healing hands. Hands that had held lives together in buildings that weren't supposed to exist. Miguel sat across from her in his Army basic training uniform, a recommendation letter from Hayes folded in his pocket, his path forward mapped by people who understood what it meant to be Elena's son. Hayes joined them minutes later, his recovery complete, the code that had nearly killed him erased by the field thoracotomy and the weeks of careful restoration that came after. His new assignment waited in San Diego, but he'd made the drive north to Colorado Springs first. "You saved my life twice," Hayes said, and his voice was the kind of quiet that meant everything. "Once in Tikrit. Once in room 342. I spent 5 years searching because I needed to say thank you." Elena wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, the same cheap cafeteria coffee she'd bought the day Mercer mocked her at the vending machine, the same coffee machine where she'd swallowed her pride and kept moving forward. "You didn't need to search. I was always here. Just invisible." "Not anymore," Miguel said, nodding toward the nurses' station where 3 residents waited to shadow her morning shift, their faces respectful, eager, looking at her the way people look at legends they didn't know were real. Through the cafeteria window, across the street at the community college gymnasium, Dr. Mercer set up a CPR dummy for a minimum wage certification class. His medical license was gone. His career was gone. His reputation had been erased with the same efficiency Elena had once used to disappear. But he was still alive. Still breathing. Still teaching CPR to people who had no idea who he'd been, what he'd done, what his silence had cost. He dropped the dummy. It fell to the gymnasium floor with the sound of plastic on concrete. He knelt to pick it up, his movement slow, mechanical, the movements of a man learning how to exist in a world where no one knew his name. Elena finished her coffee. Set down the cup. Stood to head back to her shift, no longer invisible, no longer erased, no longer silent. Just Captain Elena Martinez, exactly who she always was. "Power is not a title," she said as she passed her son, as she passed the SEAL who'd searched 5 years for her, as she moved toward the doors that had once tried to close her out. "Power is the ability to help." If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your value, subscribe and let me know in the comments. Like this video if you believe the quiet ones hold the most strength. And tell me, what would you do if the world finally saw who you'd been all along?